All right, I think we're on. Welcome to virtual DragonCon and the 2020 High Fantasy track. We're glad that you've chosen to join us. My name is Jim Wert. I'm one of the staff members of High Fantasy, and I'm joined by Kirsten Cairns, another regular at DragonCon, and really our special guest of today, John Garth, who has just released his newest book, which is the whole focus for our panel today. Let me say a few things first about High Fantasy and what we're trying to do. It's one of the many tracks, fan-based tracks at DragonCon with a focus on things fantasy with a dash of epic. So if you're interested in world building or dragons or wizards or orcs battling elves or dwarves, those kinds of things, you've come to the right place. And we're glad you're with us. It's a place that's good for a COVID-19 kind of a world, because high fantasy is where you can go to escape the kinds of things that have you trapped in quarantine or find consolation from the things you can't escape. So glad to have you with us.
And of course, one of the patriarchs of fantasy and of those kind of stories through last century and into the modern era is, of course, JRR Tolkien. And his writings and the writings that have been inspired by his have always been a core part of the high fantasy world and the high fantasy track here at DragonCon.
Indeed. My name is Jim Wert. I'm on the, as I said, the high fantasy track staff and have been there ever since we started the high fantasy track. My particular interest or area of shepherding is in the Inklings world. So I care a lot about making sure that we add content, not only for C.S. Lewis and Narnia, but especially for JRR Tolkien, which is the concentration here this morning for us, or this afternoon, whenever you're watching this.
And I'm Kirsten Cairns. I'm a staffer at the OneRing.net. If you're a OneRing.net regular, you may know me there as Green Dragon. And I'm also a regular guest and speaker at DragonCon.
Indeed. And most importantly, we have John Garth with us. John, thank you.
Hello.
Yeah, John is a journalist, a writer. I'll let you introduce yourself, but at least you are a regular releaser of books. I first came to know you in 2003 and have soaked a lot in Tolkien and the Great War, and have been reveling in the worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien as well. Anything we need to know about you, John? You're coming to us from...
I've been a professional journalist since leaving Oxford University when I was 22. I studied English language and literature there. And I suppose, I've learned two different ways of writing from that, news writing, mass appeal, but also, literary analysis and so on. And I make my living nowadays as a freelance journalist, which includes both writing and editing. I also edit and proofread books.
Good.
And where have you been locked down, John?
I've been locked down variously in Florida and in Hampshire, England, which is where I am now.
Which is safer, Florida or...
At the moment, England, yeah. Hopefully by the time this goes out, Florida will have things more under control.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things, and I'm sure we may get into this, but you talk about yourself as both a researcher as well as a journalist, and that sensibility comes through very clearly in your books. They're obviously very well researched, but also expressed in ways that, as you say, the mass market or the common reader can find very approachable and interesting. So,
well, thank you. I mean, the research thing goes back to, I suppose, 2 points really. One is that I read The Lord of the Rings, this information-dense epic, when I was 9. So, that sparked curiosity, and I delved into everything I could find about Tolkien that existed then, and everything new that came along as it came along. And secondly, actually, probably because of Tolkien also, I became interested in family history. So in my 20s, when probably I should have been out getting drunk more often, I was spending a lot of my time in archives in England, researching my family history. And that taught me, patience, diligence, and the need for verification, for accuracy. And then into that you have to fold the fact that I'm a journalist too. So while of course I want people to read what I write, I also want it to be reliable. I want to be seen as a trustworthy source. So this is all a major factor for me in the books I've written on Tolkien.
Right.
When you're working hard on that kind of being a reliable source, having that kind of academic approach to it, how do you then make the step to make sure that what you release isn't sort of an academic thesis? That does it come naturally to you that it just is readable anyway, or do you have to consciously think, all right, I'm doing all this groundwork, but I've got to make sure what I put out there is a page turner, as it were, which I think your Tolkien and the Great War in particular really is great. It's a very gripping read, it is a page turner.
It's actually really, really hard work. I can hear cries of first world problems here, but I think people underestimate how difficult writing well is. And even I underestimate how difficult writing well is every time I sit down to try to do it. It's always harder than I expect. So what happens is I have my information, I try to organize it clearly in my head, and in notes, and I set about writing as clearly as I can from the outset. I'm one of those writers who doesn't write a full draft and then comes back to it and tinkers with it and reorganizes it, polishes it. With me, it's more like an evolution. It's constantly being rephrased. I can't really get through a sentence without turning back and trying to improve it.
That's very Tolkien-esque of you. very, very niggling, so that's good.
It's good, except, things take time, and sometimes it feels very, very painful. I mean, this book, The Worlds of JRR Tolkien, I figured when I signed the contract to write it, that it would be a straightforward piece of something rather like writing a series of 1,000-word features for a newspaper. And I could write a 1,000-word feature for a newspaper in a day.
Yeah.
No problem. However, it turned out to be much harder because the density of the information, the interconnection of everything, both in Tolkien's work and in his life and in history and literature itself, and the way I see it all, proved to be a very difficult assault course to negotiate.
Jim and I were just talking before about how intriguing the layout, the way that you have structured the worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien is, the sort of categories that you've chosen to chop it up into. But one of the things that I love about that is that it makes it, and this was Jim's word when we were talking about it, it makes it very much sort of a coffee table book, in that it is a book that you can read cover to cover and it's fascinating, but you can also dip into it. I love how you have like little insert boxes with here's a tale about this, or flicking through it the first time. The Brocéliande forest in France is one of my favorite regions in France. I was flicking through and there was a little box talking about the word Brocéliande, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. So it is a book that you can go through and look at the beautiful pictures, you can read the little excerpts. I don't know if that was, again, sort of a conscious thing, or if that just organically happened as you organized your thoughts, that it turned into this kind of categorizing.
A bit of both, actually. There's a book, I think it's by Norman Davis, A History of Europe, which I saw years ago, which had panels in. So in a sense, it gives you two different ways of reading the book. You can read it straight through, or you can dip, like you say. If you're trying to read it straight through, inevitably you keep thinking, well, at what point do I read that panel?
That was my problem with your book.
I think that's part of the fun myself. you're always thinking, oh, there's something else I should be reading. I think that's nice and rich. So there was that in the back of my mind, and I used that previously in my little book, Tolkien at Exeter College.
Yeah, thank you.
Exeter College, Oxford. And available from all good websites, which are owned by me. Yes, it appeals to my taste. But with this book, The Worlds of JRR Tolkien, it wasn't my initial plan, but I simply realized as I went through the difficulty of tying everything I had to say into one continuous piece of prose was almost insurmountable. So it was much more sensible to break it up. And because of the kind of book it is with pictures anyway, and that kind of page layout, I think it works really beautifully.
Yeah. I want to go deeper into why you chose the sections that you did and where you chose to focus your effort. But first I want to go back to your 9-year-old story.
Yeah.
So you read The Lord of the Rings. Did you read The Hobbit first?
Oh, no.
No, okay, right into the thick of it.
I was aware of The Hobbit from, I don't know how old, but certainly 7, because my sisters had a copy. But it wasn't something I did anything more with than flip open and look at the maps.
Right.
Then my mother bought a copy of The Lord of the Rings, single volume with a beautiful cover illustration by Pauline Baynes.
Yes.
Which is like an archway through trees, and the scene of the Shire beyond, and then on the back there's a scene of Mordor through trees, and all these strange creatures crawling around the roots. I don't know if you know this cover. And I would, from I suppose the age of 8, this book was the biggest book on our bookshelves, and it had this bold yellow spine with the word Tolkien, whatever that might mean, on it. And I would pull it down, open it up, and look at the maps. And then I found that there were other things inside there, like the Doors of Durin and the ring inscription. And I was just fascinated. I loved the flavour of the names, the invented language names. And I'd already read the Narnia books, and I'd read another great series by Alan Garner, a British fantasy author, who was writing for children in those days, called The Weird Stone of Brisingamen. And both of these stories had come equipped with maps. So I kind of knew that The Lord of the Rings hit certain points that were mine, and I knew that I was going to go there, but I really thought this is such a big book. I probably won't do it till I don't know, I probably thought 12 was big enough.
That's right. 5 years from now.
Well, when you're 9, 12 seems very old. But anyway, I just sat down one day, passing some time. I was waiting to watch Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, in fact. I was into horror at that stage. Picked the book up and just never looked back. I read it in about 5 weeks, I think. Probably a lot of it went over my head, but it kept me going and made me want to turn back and begin again pretty much straight away. So that was that, yeah.
Yeah.
Are you one? Sorry, Jim. I was going to say you say begin again. Are you one of those people who revisits Lord of the Rings regularly?
Actually, not as often as many people I know, and not as often as I would like. I have revisited it when it's necessary. And most of the time, I'm reading other things, and I always feel like I've got far too much to read that I don't already know. I know The Lord of the Rings very well, both from reading, from start to finish, but also from diving in and treating it as a research resource. The last time I read it properly, I actually listened to it in the recording by Rob Inglis, which I recommend. And I did that for a refresher when I was writing a course to teach to American undergraduates in Las Vegas, where I had a writer's fellowship for a year. And that was great to listen to it rather than read it, because you just notice different things.
Yeah.
You know, and there's a different pace to it. You know, your eye does not get lazy. It does not. You know.
Yeah, there's actually a recorded version of the unabridged Silmarillion. I forget who did it.
Martin.
And that was a remarkably different perspective on the Silmarillion. It really is, as you say, a different experience when you're listening.
I've also read The Lord of the Rings out loud, incidentally. So that brings an. If you read something out loud, you certainly get to understand it better and in a different way, particularly characterization.
We forced all 4 of our children to do that with my wife and me out loud, assigning parts. It probably took us 2 or 3 years to get through it, but
well, I hope they were happy about that.
Most of them. I think some had some grudges, but.
Well, my first experience with Tolkien was my dad reading it to me and my brothers, and in fact, really, he was reading it to my brothers because I was too young at the time. But I insisted on sitting in the back of the room and listening in.
So John, at what point in this process did you start wanting to dig into inspirations and sources, and in what form did that take?
Well, this goes back to the origins of Tolkien and the Great War.
There it is. It's a wonderful book. Highly recommend. 5 stars.
Nice paperback, though.
So one of the things that I always loved about Tolkien, as I said, was the invented names, the invented languages.
Yes.
And that I was very nerdy as a child. I played Dungeons and Dragons, and I made Elvish dictionaries. And I thoroughly enjoyed when Christopher Tolkien was editing and writing the History of Middle-earth volumes, 12 volumes. They were more or less annual. So it was like getting
I remember
nerdy Tolkien annual every year. And I would devour them, and I particularly would pounce on anything new about Quenya or Sindarin or Khuzdul or one of these other languages. And when the 12th volume came out, The Peoples of Middle-earth, and I think it was 1996, I felt rather bereaved, and I decided that I was going to revisit the whole lot on the pretext of trying to make the ultimate Elvish dictionary. And anyone who understands the way Tolkien worked and the way the History of Middle-earth demonstrates that he worked knows that it's all about process. It's a massive flux developing detail. And the languages were no less subject to that than the stories were. So I knew you could not have a simple, the kind of dictionary you have for French or German or whatever, where you could use it, you have a definitive word for anything. No. Tolkien's concepts kept changing. So I saw it as a kind of stratified Elvish dictionary, right? And what this entailed was going through those History of Middle-earth volumes and trying to catalogue all the texts that are mentioned in them and work out what order they were written in. So Christopher Tolkien does a great deal of the working out of what order they were written in, but I always felt that, maybe more could be worked out. And I worked on this, built a database and worked on this for about 2 years. And then at the end of that, I actually never finished because I got caught up with historical research. And the reason is, sorry, this is a really roundabout answer to your question. While trying to do this Elvish work, I was reading the first and second volumes of the History of Middle-earth, collectively, the Book of Lost Tales, about what Tolkien was writing during the First World War. And I was noting down this poem written in this army training camp, 1916. And I thought, well, it would be really interesting and perhaps illuminating for my project to find out more about what Tolkien did during the First World War. And I just got swept away with that. By coincidence, just a few weeks later, after I just decided I'm going to write a fanzine article about Tolkien war experiences, his personal officer service record, his military service record, was released to the public for the first time, along with all the other service records of officers in the British Army in the First World War. So I was straight through the door to be the first person to look at that. And a lot of other things came into the project as I went on. And it left Elvish way behind, but not completely, because if you've read Tolkien the Great War, you can see that you talk about the essential role that his language invention took in the creation of Middle-earth, initially and in an ongoing way. But yes, so it's also a literary history, it's a biography of Tolkien, it's a group biography of Tolkien and his friends. And some people have even said, you know, this is the best military history of this particular battalion. So, you know, it's all kinds of things.
And were the seeds for the current book, The Worlds of JRR Tolkien, I felt when I was reading Tolkien and the Great War, that I sort of sensed that maybe the seeds for the next book were in there because there was material that you had gathered that you're like, well, it's too much for this one book. There's too much, and you even mention it in the preface yourself about that you don't go too much into how the experiences you directly influence the writing, because that's kind of another exploration in and of itself. So did you feel when you finished Tolkien and the Great War that you were already germinating the next project?
Yeah. In fact, I had tried to write about the impact of the war on what Tolkien wrote after the Book of Lost Tales. So the Book of Lost Tales was basically 1914, its roots, 1915 rather, through till about 1919 and a little bit beyond. But I tried to write about the later Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings in terms of Tolkien's war experience. But I wasn't terribly satisfied with what I was writing, and in the end, it came out. And I'm glad of that, because I think it's a tidier book, and it allows you to absorb Tolkien's experiences and form your own opinions without being browbeaten by me. Whereas in my new book, I'm trying to browbeat. In my new book, I feel able to give my own opinion because I've put the facts out there already in the earlier.
Well, let's dive in and let you do some browbeating on maybe some of the content. And actually, under the general heading of interesting stuff you discovered, at least when I was reading the book, some of your recounts of Tolkien's earliest life, starting literally when he was 3 years old on a ship, were fascinating. So could you talk about some of those early inspirations, whether it was that passage from South Africa to Britain, or that my Lautenbrunnen scene in the background and his 19-year-old trip to Switzerland and something?
Yeah. So somewhere, and I can't bring this quote to mind. I know Tolkien says that, you know, early experiences are so hugely, disproportionately important compared to later experiences. And I think probably most people who analyze these things at all will probably say that's true of themselves. For example, I know that, you know, people tend to stick with their musical taste, the musical taste they had when they were in their teens or 20s, and these really stick with them. And we know from Tolkien's, there's a book that Tolkien's children wrote, came out in 1992, the Tolkien Family Album. We know that Tolkien actually remembered things about when he was in Southern Africa as a child. He left when he was just, what was he, 4, 3?
I think
3, I think.
Yeah.
Extremely young. And you can see this is why Well, it takes me time to write because I think I know something, but I desperately want to check. And normally, if I were writing it, yes, I would be
Right,
going.
right there with you.
He remembered kids diving into the sea at the port where they sailed from in Africa. He remembered the Indian Ocean. He remembered arriving at a city on a hillside, which he later took to be Lisbon in Portugal. So I just dug into the online newspaper archive. So the Times newspaper has a fabulous archive that goes back to, I think, 1785. And you can put in a search term, and I knew the name of the ship, the SS Guelph. And lo and behold, I was able to identify, the dates of the journey and the fact that they stopped off at the islands of Madeira and Tenerife. And these are volcanic islands that jut out from the sea, mountain islands. And although The Lord of the Rings barely touches the sea and The Hobbit touches it not at all, anyone who's read the Silmarillion knows how important, how vital the sea is to Tolkien's imagination. And actually, mountain islands come up again and again in his legendarium, and they're always places of awe or wonder.
I'll share a quick picture just to illustrate. So there's Tenerife as an example.
Right.
That is talking about.
So it seems quite feasible to me. Of course, it's speculation, but I don't think it's remotely outrageous speculation. That a young child with Tolkien's intelligence and proven capacity for memory would see that, and it would make a mark on his memory, even if it wasn't one that he consciously was aware of. And it would help to build his tastes for what is marvelous, what is new, what it feels like to be a voyager on the sea and to arrive somewhere, which is something that he writes about again and again.
And so where do you see those kinds of mountainous or volcanic islands showing up particularly in Tolkien's writing?
You see, for example, there's the idea that the mountain of Númenor is still visible above the sea.
Right.
And it's a volcanic mountain, so there's that. You see people arriving at other islands where you don't know about the mountains, whether there are mountains in Tol Eressëa, the lonely isle of the elves.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind betting it, but we know that that scene is described in The Lord of the Rings. It's described because Frodo gets there eventually, and he sees it's as if a curtain of silver rain has been drawn back, and he sees a far green country under a swift sunrise.
Right.
These are words I find very moving. And I think that tallies so well with the fact that Tolkien himself arrived in England, which he fell in love with for its greenness, because it was so remote and unlike where he was born in Southern Africa. I think that must have made an immense impact on him.
It's interesting because reading your book and listening to you talking about it now as well, it seems to me you're talking about places and physical places, scenery, etc. But it seems to me that the influence they have is more about feeling, that how those places make you feel, and how Tolkien was made to feel by different places. Would you say that's accurate, that it's more about an emotional reaction to a place than a kind of visual reaction?
I don't know. I would probably say that they were fairly balanced. But it's also, there's a third thing here, which is, I suppose, how these things end up as threads in a tapestry. So you can trace threads back to Switzerland, like the scene that Jim's sitting in, which is the Valley of Lauterbrunnen in Switzerland, the clear inspiration for Rivendell.
It is.
You can trace threads back to Tolkien's 1911 Swiss walking trip from Rivendell, from any scene in the Misty Mountains, from Dunharrow too. And these make sense in their own terms within the story. You know, Tolkien's not just trying to shove something in because, you know, I fancy writing about Switzerland again. He wants to write about mountains because mountains inspire him. He experienced wonder and sometimes danger there. And these are resources for him as a storyteller. And he's expert at weaving them in so that they feel that they belong in the larger picture of Middle-earth.
Yeah, to Kirsten's point about both the visual and the emotional, you know, you can read Bilbo longing to see the mountains again. And I almost wonder if he's expressing the same kind of longing Tolkien might have had.
Well, sometimes, you know, you can read what a character says in Lord of the Rings, and look at what Tolkien's saying in letters around the same time, and they match rather closely.
Right.
I don't know if that one does in particular, but there are letters where Tolkien says, there's one letter where he says, well, people think I'm you know, besotted just with trees. Actually, I think the thing that appeals to me most of all is barrenness, and that's a real surprise.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Because when you think of barrenness, you think, well, maybe Mordor, right? But Tolkien's talking about the high glaciated landscapes of mountain country above the tree line, and the inspiration of that.
Right.
That's interesting. I had a very good friend who lived in New Hampshire at the end of her life, and she was Scottish by heritage, and she's like, I don't like these New Hampshire mountains, they're all messed around with trees on them. You know, she wanted to see the mountain underneath, not the sort of furry tree clad mountain, you know. So maybe that's what Tolkien was driving at.
Yeah, well, look at that picture behind Jim. You can see, you know, the tree clad bit. Well, yeah, that's really, really nice, but it's those high white peaks that really draw you in.
Yeah, draw you in, and there must be giants up there somewhere. Almost certain.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Now, Tolkien tells a great story about how he was nearly wiped out by an avalanche.
Yeah.
Not a snow avalanche, but an avalanche of stones from a high snowfield that was being melted by the hot sun of that summer.
Right.
And something that goes right into The Hobbit.
Exactly.
Right.
I resonated a lot with that, but that's my own personal inspiration on a volcano in New Zealand where I was almost killed by falling rocks as well. But that's another story. Another part of that 19-year-old trip was down the Rhine River, which I don't know if you guys have done. I have, and riding by the Drachenfels and the Lorelei. Do you see places where Tolkien picks that up as well?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that kind of thing must have coloured his descriptions of the great rivers of Anduin and Sirion, certainly. And the Rhine in that area is also tied up with the legend of Siegfried or Sigurd, which was a central interest to Tolkien as a scholar of Germanic legend, and gets woven into the story of Turin Turambar in the Silmarillion too. So yeah, I think the whole experience of the river voyage in Lord of the Rings, that's key to that. I theorize that the story of the Lorelei, which is not actually a true legend in the sense that it's a piece of fiction that has now become more or less accepted as being ancient, but it involves a woman who leaps to her death off the rock and becomes a kind of siren, a mermaid who lures sailors to their doom on the rocks. I think that it sounds pretty likely, because of that area's associations with Sigurd as well, that affected Tolkien's description of the story of Turin Turambar and his sister, and what happened there at the end of that story.
Right, leaping off of cliffs. Yeah, fascinating. Good stuff. I'm interested in any eureka moments that you may have had, whether it was immediately when you were writing the book or even as you were assembling all of the materials. As a deep researcher, what were the gems that you felt like you were able to uncover, and that you're glad that you can bring to us through the book?
Well, you know, a lot of eureka moments are actually more like kind of eureka moments or months, because you have a thought and then it takes a long time before you've brought all the pieces in front of you and you can examine them and see whether they fit together, and if they do, fit them together. I think that the most exciting moment for me in this book was hang on a second.
No? We pause now.
That is a wonderful bookshelf back there. It is so beautiful.
It would be a wonderful bookshelf if it actually had the book on it. But it does not, unfortunately. I'll have to just tell you about it. So there's a book called Romantic Moderns, which is about the English imagination and landscape in the 1930s, principally, which was a time when things were really changing for the average person and their relationship with this land, because of, oddly enough, the car and the coach, and to some extent the train. So people were getting out. They were able to get out in the countryside more than previously. And the oil company, the petroleum company Shell, was a great promoter of motor transport, obviously, and commissioned some wonderful artwork for posters for a campaign to get people behind the wheel and touring and looking at their own heritage.
I'll share my screen very quickly while you're mentioning. I'll try to grab a few of those posters for us.
Brilliant. Okay. Yeah.
And you've got another one in your book that you.
And that's the one I'm talking about. So in this book, Romantic Moderns, lo and behold, there's a painting, and it's from that very series, and it looks like Tolkien's picture of the hill, Hobbiton across the. Not exactly like it, because the proportions are different, but you have the central hill. It has a bald top with something on top of it. So in Tolkien's picture, it's a tree. It has a windy road coming down to the foreground, and in the foreground there's an angular building, the mill on the water, in Hobbiton. But in this picture, it's a picture of Farringdon Folly, which is a hilltop tower 18 miles from Oxford. So immediately I'm thinking, wow, here's something that not only looks like a Tolkien artwork, but it's local to him. And then I look at the date on it. Thank you very much. Then I look Then I look at the date on it, and that was painted and published in 1936. Right. Tolkien did his artwork for The Hobbit in January 1937. Right. That poster was displayed on the sides of the trucks that Shell used to deliver its petrol, its gas, to petrol stations all over the country, and it would have been very visible to anyone out and about, in the way that, you know, a modern, whatever, Coca-Cola advert might be. So I'm fairly confident that Tolkien saw that, and it gave him some ideas for how he wanted to present that image of the hill, Hobbiton across the water. Hugely ironic, because, you know, one of the things that Tolkien objected to was the motor car and the damage it did. But I think not so much at that time. I don't think that's something he was deeply aware of until a bit later. So I then looked at the story of Farringdon Folly. And when that picture was painted in 1936, it was actually new. The picture was painted by the man who built it. He was a man called Lord Berners. He was an artist, a diplomat, a poet, a novelist. He was gay. He was very flamboyant. He was very eccentric. The press loved him. And he had decided to build a tower on top of a hill that came with the land of the house that he had bought in 1930s, I think. He decided to build a tower on it to annoy his neighbours. And it worked. It worked. There was a long planning dispute about this tower that ran through 1936 and into 1935. It was reported in the local papers and in the national papers because of his notoriety, his eccentricity. And the complaints were, this is going to ruin it, the landscape, the view. We don't see the point of this tower, right? Now, as it happens, I also knew that Tolkien wrote a very famous academic paper about the Old English epic poem Beowulf, in which he had some complex ideas to get across about what he felt was misunderstood about this poem. So Tolkien's complaint about the poem was essentially that scholarship was misusing the poem. It was looking at it for all kinds of academic reasons, but forgetting that the poem is a poem, is a work of art. And Tolkien comes up with what he calls an allegory. And of course,
which he never did.
Tolkien allegory, what?
Allegory, but he did. In this case, he liked a small, perfectly formed allegory, and here it was. He created an allegory where a man builds a tower out of old stone found in a field, and his neighbours, not understanding the point of the tower, knock it down so that they can examine the stones. So the poem is the tower, the neighbours are the scholars, and the poet is the man who built the tower, obviously. And the payoff line, the punch line, is that but from the top of that tower, the man could see the sea. Right? And that is that indescribable, unquantifiable something that art gives you. Tolkien wrote that allegory while that tower controversy was going on. It was fresh. And he delivered that lecture first of all to to Oxford undergraduates, students, and then to members of the British Academy in London. And I am convinced that he couldn't possibly have delivered that little story about the man on the tower and the neighbours who don't get it without evoking in the eyes of his audience that ongoing amusing story about Lord Berners and Farringdon Folly.
Right.
So I think this is a way of very early in his lecture catching the attention of the audience. He's a performer,
Yeah.
And this would have entertained them. And then from that, as you know, if you've read my book, there are other ramifications to this, and that tower leaps the barrier from allegory into what Tolkien called feigned history.
Yeah.
It stops being an allegory and it becomes part of the Middle-earth story. It becomes one of the elf towers west of the Shire.
Right.
And I love the fact that, that when Tolkien writes about the hobbits, they are the neighbours who don't understand the
Don't like it.
towers, right? And then by a more circuitous and twisty route, it becomes Orthanc.
Yeah.
Right. But my man Sam took up residence near the towers, so.
Yes, absolutely. And there you see, I think that Tolkien's weaving in other things. So one of my points in the book, I really find it a bit tedious, I suppose, to see again and again people saying this place was the inspiration for this place, as if there's a one-to-one mapping, as if all Tolkien had to do was to see place X and he would make place Y in Middle Earth. Job done. You know,
Mm.
I think Tolkien was a synthesizer, someone who took things, separate things, and wove them together to make a new thing, an alchemist. And I think in the case of Sam and his descendants, and living near those Western Elven towers, he was drawing on the Tolkien family, the Suffield family, and then his brother Hilary Tolkien's family living in the West Midlands. And Hilary lived very near Broadway Tower, which is on the Cotswold Hills, and looks towards Wales. And I think that's a little kind of a little nod to family affection, family history. A private one. I don't suppose Tolkien cared for it to be something that was broadcast publicly. It didn't matter to him. But he was also writing for his own family.
And I'm curious when you say sort of a private thing that he might not have wanted broadcast, and when his allegory about the people tearing down the tower to look at the stones in detail. I wonder how you think Tolkien would feel about your book in particular, and the other kind of scholarship that is produced about him and his writing and his works. Would he feel that in writing a book like this, you are in some way tearing down the tower to look at the stones? And
he who breaks a thing to find out what it is has left wisdom.
Yeah.
I don't think anything gets broken in this process. So this is my view, not Tolkien's view. I personally think that this kind of research and hopefully this kind of book enriches your experience of the stories. No, maybe not if you read my book before you read Lord of the Rings, but if you know and love the Lord of the Rings and then you come to my book, it could give you extra reasons to love it, That's also the experience I had with researching Tolkien's war experiences and thinking about how he describes certain things in The Lord of the Rings. I don't feel like they are what I'm not trying to do is tear away what Tolkien is writing in order to reveal the truth within it. I'm trying to look through what Tolkien's writing, and so that the thing behind it kind of shines a light on the writing. I suppose that's another way of looking at it. What Tolkien would have thought, honestly, I think that's kind of impossible to say, because when Tolkien was alive, study of his books was really in its infancy. And he did take offense at people trying to write anything about it virtually. But I think that's quite understandable, because, as he said, people knew very little about him. They were prone to error. Now we do know a vast amount more about him, partly thanks to Humphrey Carpenter, who wrote the authorized biography, partly due to Christopher Tolkien, who has edited all the Silmarillion and the history of Middle-earth and so on, partly due to my work and to the work of Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull, produced encyclopedic books on Tolkien, which are phenomenal, essentially. So it's harder to make mistakes as long as you're diligent. And I think maybe Tolkien would appreciate that. If you look at what Tolkien says in his published letters, you'll find that his opinions, he tends to give different opinions at different times or to different people. So, if he's talking to someone he doesn't know, he's much more guarded than if he's talking to a friend.
But I think also what's intriguing to me is that in his own studies, in the things that infused him and fired him up when he was learning as a young man and at university and beyond, he loved to, as it were, take things apart and look at the nuts and bolts. I mean, that, with languages, he loved to see how things were crafted. And so I feel like surely he would have some empathy and sympathy for people who are just interested in saying, as you say, not tearing it down, but seeing what is perhaps illuminating it or behind it, or because that was the kind of person he was himself. I think he always wanted to find out more, read more, get that dictionary off the shelf and find out more about that language.
Yeah, well, I would hope so, if he was in a reasonable mood.
There was,
It wasn't always. I mean, Tolkien could be a curmudgeon, you know. He could write things when he was in a very bad mood. So one thing that I pick up on in my chapter Four Winds, where I talk about Tolkien's influences from different cultures around the world. It's been Tolkien's influence from Celtic legend and lore has, I think, been underestimated, and that's largely because Tolkien associated himself explicitly with Northern and Germanic mythologies and languages, and also because he said some outrageously offensive things about Celtic mythology. But when you look at when he said these things, one of them is in a letter, a response to his publisher, to whom he had proposed the publication of the Silmarillion as a follow-up to The Hobbit in 1937. And the publisher's reader had criticised the Silmarillion as being incomprehensible, in that way that Celtic art often is to an Anglo-Saxon eye. This was paraphrase. This is what he said, you know.
Yeah.
And Tolkien, rather than defending Celtic mythology, which he could easily have done, just basically ripped into it, and nothing to do with that. Nothing to do with Celtic stuff at all, you know. I think if Tolkien had, you know, slept on it, maybe he would have written a different letter. And it certainly doesn't reflect many demonstrable influences from Celtic mythology, and obviously Celtic languages are well primary inspiration for the Elvish language syndrome.
there is an interesting letter to the curmudgeonly facets or side of Tolkien that I just saw on auction. It was handwritten, but it was to someone. I think he turned into a children's author eventually, but he asked him to fill out a questionnaire. And this was abrupt and certain as far as what he thought about those kinds of things. So that's funny. I think you're right about your project, because it's nuanced, it's integrated versus simplistic, which makes me want to ask, hey, John, are there any simplistic myths or assertions that you would prefer would just die a quiet death, that would be dispelled and then we could be done with them?
Yeah, I mean, I take issue with a couple reasonably prominently in the book. I tried not to make it, you know,
not too much
operation, but I do deal with the idea of the supposed two towers of Birmingham. So Tolkien lived in a street when he was in his teens, or younger than that, where if you walked up the road, you came to another street and there were two towers in it.
Yeah.
And that has become associated with the fact that The Two Towers is the title of the second volume of The Lord of the Rings. There's no evidence whatsoever of any connection between those two towers and the title The Two Towers. And there are more fundamental problems with that idea. One is, the primary one, frankly, is that the title The Two Towers was a title of convenience that was invented after Tolkien had finished writing The Lord of the Rings. We don't even know if Tolkien invented it himself. It was invented in discussions with his publisher. Tolkien wasn't happy with it. He accepted it begrudgingly, and when he first accepted it, he said, I don't know which of the several towers these are supposed to be, but I suppose it'll give the readers something to ponder. So the idea that the two towers in that street in Birmingham, which is, one is a waterworks tower and one is a folly, like Farringdon Folly, a tower with no particular point, a luxury. The idea that those two towers inspired Orthanc and Minas Morgul, which I think are the two towers that Tolkien finally settled on as being in the title, it is clear nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's another thing that I've addressed recently, actually, on Twitter with a long thread. The story of excavations at Lydney in Gloucestershire.
Yeah, the ring and the tablet. Yeah.
It's too complicated to explain here, but I've got an appendix here where in the book where I say, there's no evidence that Tolkien had any close connection with these excavations, even though he provided a note for the published report on the excavations, and nothing further should be construed from those excavations in connection with his work.
And we only have about 5 minutes or so left, so we're heading to the home stretch on some questions. I know I have at least one for you, but Kirsten, I think you may have one as well.
I do, but I have so many. It's so difficult.
An hour or two we'll be covering.
Well, we should find out from you, John, what's next for you. That for sure is what can we expect from you in terms of Tolkien scholarship, but also what other projects you have on the go that you'd like to share with us.
Right. Well, I suppose I've got a few irons in the fire that will spin out and interconnect with what I've published so far. And the principal one, which is probably about half written, is a book that I'm calling Tolkien's Mirror. And it's about how Tolkien's work reflects what was going on in his lifetime, the crises of his time. So, Tolkien and the Great War were partly about that, but again, this is a way of unpacking how those inspirations worked in greater detail, and it's really fascinating. But I also cover the story of Númenor in relation to what was going on when that was first inspired, which was, as I've discovered, right at the end of 1936, an absolutely disastrous year for peace, when the Spanish Civil War broke out and the Nazis and fascists were flexing their muscles, and the show trials were going on in the Soviet Union, and that will also lead further on into The Lord of the Rings as a reflection not only of Tolkien's experiences in the First World War, but also, controversially, of what was going on in the Second World War while he was writing it. Something that he strenuously denies, of course, in his foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings. But I think I can demonstrate that that's not, we shouldn't take that absolutely at face value.
I look forward to reading that. Do you have an idea when it might be coming out? Do you have a deadline imposed on you?
I don't yet have a publisher. My immediate challenge at the moment is I've got to turn the worlds of JRR Tolkien into an online series of lectures for Signum University this fall. And then beyond that, hopefully, I can get a publisher interested in Tolkien's Mirror and get a deadline for that, which is essential. Never try and write a book with no deadline.
Aha, there you are. Advice to authors out there. You touched on Númenor just briefly, and we're not going to ask you to speculate on Amazon series and whatever in the world they have in mind. But anything else that would be helpful for us to know in terms of sources of inspiration, or just how we come to Númenor and its role or spot in the legendary?
Well, I mean, Númenor feeds from lots of legendary material about fortunate islands where things are just right, and also into the idea of Thomas More's utopia, which is an island, a perfect society, and Tolkien turns it, of course, into a dystopia, and this is part. He wrote it partly in connection with a wager with C.S. Lewis to write science fiction. So the idea of dystopias, although his stories are set in the past, this is also So drawing on something that's very important in science fiction too. What else? Yeah, I think that there's a lot in there about Tolkien's faith. So the idea of persecution of Catholics at various times in history probably underlies the persecution of the faithful Elendil and his
so the escape of Elendil and his 9 ships to Middle Earth. Interesting. As an author of Tolkien, or Tolkien-centric, not exclusively, what accounts for his enduring legacy, his enduring popularity? As you've approached him, it seems global in the interest in sustaining after 100 years.
Well, he was uniquely talented in ways I don't think we'll see again. You know, not only as a world builder, but as a language builder. And you know, if you're a language builder, you're not just making up words, the shape of words, the sound of words, but you're also thinking in terms of how people think. So he's a culture builder too. I think these are all, he was able to do something much richer than most other people could manage, even looking at things separately, but as a whole, putting it all together, I think he was unique. I think he was really wrong about himself to say that, you know, his role was to create a mythology for England. You know, he wrote a mythology involving England and Britain more widely, so Celtic as well as Anglo-Saxon cultures, but he drew in so many other things that it's much more global than that. And I think really this is something that became apparent to me writing the book. He's such a great celebrator of the world in which we live, and a defender of it for itself as a natural state of being, a place that we should cherish and preserve. And I think that speaks to us universally and vitally now.
It's interesting. I've seen a lot of my friends online, even obviously, as you can imagine, a lot of my friends are into the Tolkien fandom, but even people that I didn't know were into it. I've seen them saying, I'm reading Lord of the Rings again at the moment, and they find great comfort in it. There are so many lines in Tolkien that, as you say, that celebrate the world around us, and that also kind of tell us that there are reasons not to give up hope in dark places, you know, and I think that maybe is part of, right now we're all looking for things that are not, as Jim said at the beginning, escapist, but also that give us consolation and hope.
Yeah, and this ties into the fact that Tolkien started writing this during the catastrophe of his time, First World War.
Yeah. He had
to survive mentally, emotionally, and I think this was one of the ways he did it, and his survival feeds back into it.
So talking of the situation that we all have found ourselves in 2020, and the reason why DragonCon is all online this year, if you had to pick one place in Tolkien's created worlds, or perhaps somewhere that you have looked at in your book, The Worlds of JRR Tolkien, that was an influence, to be locked down, what would be your choice of location?
Wouldn't anyone say Rivendell? Anyone who's a reader, you know, that would have to be it. I mean, I'm always drawn towards Lothlorien and Cairns Amroth, which I found, I think the roots for that image of the hill with the circle of trees on top, associated with Aragorn and Arwen. That's the most beautiful scene when Frodo feels like he's looking into part of the elder days. But I think you couldn't stay there for long unless you were an elf. I think Bilbo showed that one can spend some considerable time at Rivendell and be happy.
There you are.
I think I'd go with the Shire. I think I just, you know, it has a sort of, it's that English thing as well. It's that the nostalgia for that sort of chocolate box England that the you know, Victorian country gentleman type feel, and that just appeals to me. I think I could be quite happy drinking tea and being cozy in the Shire.
Me too. As long as there is a tower we can climb to see the sea.
But you see, I'm with Bilbo. Bilbo got fed up with hobbits and wanted to be somewhere else, you know. And I think hobbits are, you know, when they're at home, they can be really irritating. Honestly, Tolkien was trying to convey that, you know, in the beginning of the Lord of the Rings. It's very close to what he was writing at that time. He was rewriting Farmer Giles of Ham. If you read the social satire in Farmer Giles of Ham, you can see it's in tune with social satire about hobbits in the first chapters of the Lord of the Rings.
Well, John, I fear we've hit about 10% of our questions, and we could go much longer, but we should probably respect your time and the appetite or the ability to consume all of this. So we will leave it at that. And thank you very much for not only joining us, but for the insight and the passion that you have brought to this work and that you've shared it with us. One last word maybe from you, just where we can find you. You've already mentioned Signum, that you'll be doing a series there, SIGNUM, for anybody that wants to look that up online. I will share on the screen at least a couple of your contact points of information, but anything else that we should know about where to find you?
I'm on Twitter as John Garth Writer. I'm also on Facebook as John Garth Writer, and I have a website and blog. They're interconnected, johngarth.co.uk, which that's one of my other urgent projects, is to get these things revamped. So there's lots of information on there, but it probably looks a bit old now in terms of web design.
So look for John there. And thank you, DragonCon and High Fantasy Track, for joining us. Hope you've enjoyed it. And good luck and good grace with the rest of your con.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right.